we are quite literally facing the epic battle of our generation. In my judgment, President Obama's the most radical president ever to occupy the White House. And he is a true believer in government control of the economy, in government control of our everyday lives. And I think there's an incredible need for leadership in Washington to stand up and defend free market principles and limited government and the principles of the Constitution. I don't tend to be a fan of identity politics and racial politics. I'm running for this position, U.S. Senate, because I believe I've got the strongest proven record as a conservative, standing up, fighting for conservative principles, and winning on a national level. During the tenure that I was serving as Solicitor General, Texas repeatedly led the nation, standing up, fighting for conservative principles, and winning on a national level. A few examples. We defended the Ten Commandments monument that stands outside the state capitol. We took it to the U.S. Supreme Court and we won 5-4. We defended the Pledge of Allegiance when a federal court of appeals in California struck it down. We went to the U.S. Supreme Court and we won unanimously. We defended the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. We brought together 31 states in support of the Second Amendment, went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and we won 5-4. And most significantly, in a case called Medellin versus Texas, we stood up to an order from the World Court. The World Court, which is the judicial arm of the United Nations, tried to bind the United States and order the U.S. to reopen the convictions of 51 murderers across this country. Texas stood up to the World Court. We went to the U.S. Supreme Court. I had the honor of arguing this case twice in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. On the other side were 90 nations and was the President of the United States. And we stood up and defended U.S. sovereignty, and we won 6-3. Number one, let me give you the right answer for a Republican candidate, which is Ronald Reagan. And it happens to be not just the right answer, but actually true. For me, I very much came of age and was in school when President Reagan was president. And he exemplified for me what it meant to stand for principle, to stand for individual liberty, to stand for limited government, and to believe powerfully in American exceptionalism. I'll give you a second example, a little more recent and a little more from Texas vintage. Of recent Texas politicians, I think the elected officials whose policy views are most similar to mine was probably Senator Phil Gramm. And he was someone who, in the U.S. Senate, stood up repeatedly and defended free market principles. I'll never forget back in 1994 when Hillary Care was about to pass, and almost every Republican in the Senate was utterly spineless and afraid to stand up and oppose it. And Phil Gramm stood up and said, "This'll pass over my cold, dead political body." And if Senator Gramm hadn't had the courage to stand up and oppose the government takeover of health care, everything we've seen with Obamacare would have occurred in 1994. That's the kind of leadership we need, is principled defense of free market that can also, just as President Reagan was able to do, articulate and explain that liberty protects the rights of everyone and protects the opportunity of everyone. And I think anyone looking seriously at the issue of immigration, particularly in a post-9/11 world, realizes we have to seriously secure the border. We have to enforce the law. I strongly oppose illegal immigration, and I don't support amnesty. And I never will support amnesty, because I think as a matter of national security and as a matter of respect for rule of law, we need to secure the border and know who's entering this country. And I don't think we've treated that seriously in the past. But secondly, and I think equally important with that, we need to remain a nation that not just tolerates, but welcomes and celebrates immigrants as part of who we are and part of what makes America exceptional. As you noted, my dad came as an immigrant from Cuba in 1957. He fought in the Cuban Revolution, he was thrown in prison, he was tortured, and he fled, arriving here in Austin. He was 18 years old, he didn't speak a word of English, and he had directions at the University of Texas. And he went and got a job as a dishwasher, making 50 cents an hour. and he worked full-time, and he paid his way through UT and went to work and then started a business and worked towards the American dream. And I think that story, what is so compelling about that story, I mean, my dad's been my hero my whole life, but what's so compelling about that story is how commonplace it is. You and I and everyone has a story like that. We're a nation where all of our ancestors came here seeking freedom and opportunity. If he chooses to run, my approach to this race will be consistent. I don't intend to say a negative word about anybody in this race. I think we are going to manage to raise a very substantial amount of money. There's no doubt that to run a statewide campaign, you need resources. As you know, I spent much of 2009 campaigning for Attorney General. During that campaign, we enjoyed extraordinary success. We ended up raising over $1.3 million. We had nearly 1,000 donors from over 100 Texas cities and 25 states. And we also saw support from virtually every conservative leader statewide in Texas, from over 100 leaders of the Texas Federation of Republican Women, from a majority of the State Republican Executive Committee, and from an incredible grassroots and political network. That network will serve as the foundation, really, I hope, for this Senate race. And I don't think there's any candidate who's a shoo-in. My view of a race is I think money is necessary, but it's not sufficient. If money was enough, then Tony Sanchez would be governor of Texas, who spent in excess of $70 million trying to run for governor and didn't win. If money was enough, Meg Whitman would be governor of California. She just spent $140 million and didn't win. You've got to be able to raise money to communicate with the voters, but at the end of the day, the real question is, do you have the right message, and are you standing for the principles the voters care about?